Welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand of the company Horns of Odin. And as always, before we get into the show, I do need to do a little bit of housekeeping. Self-promotion, we have to keep the lights on here. And the best way you can support us is through our Patreon. It's just Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. It's £3 a month and you get a bonus episode every single week. So after the main show ends, we sit down with the guests and do a Q&A with the live audience, or you can submit your question ahead of time. So you get that extra episode where there's sometimes questions that I miss that people pick up on, and they do tend to be a lot of value in there. It's like I say, it's an extension of the main show. You also get ad-free episodes, early access to all the episodes. You can watch them live. Like I said, you get the live chat where there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in there every episode. And you also get access to our Discord server, which is a lovely little community of people we've built over the years. It's a nice place to hang out. And for the next tier up, you get the story time with myself and Jonas Lorentzen. We've just started going through Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology. So it's a little bit more legible than the older storytime episodes, and these are a lot of fun. They're a little bit looser. Me and Jonas tend to have a beer and we have a good laugh with those. So if you can, please just support us over on the Patreon. And if not, just leaving a 5-star rating or a positive review wherever you get your podcasts, and just a like and share across the social medias, just at Nordic Mythology Podcast. But yeah, let's jump into today's episode. It's officially the start of our spooky season. We have a bunch of guests lined up with all different spooky topics. So today I'm joined by Gwendolyne Knight, who has maybe the most fabulous name of any guest I've ever had on the podcast. Gwendolyne, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I apologize that I am a little bit distracted just now as we are beginning. But as you can see, my two cats have chosen this very moment to let loose.
I feel that also kind of fits in with our topic of witches today. And it also kind of sums up cats, that they pick the most inappropriate moment.
Exactly. To start beating the crap out of each other. I mean, siblings are as siblings do, I suppose. It always reminds me of one of my favorite woodcuts from an early modern witchcraft pamphlet, which is an old woman who's sort of feeding her familiars, and they always look so nice and docile. And then you have moments like this.
Mm-hmm.
But oh well. 'Tis life.
It is, yeah. What do they say? Never work with kids or animals? Is that the
exactly? Yeah. when you're in films, never work with children or animals.
Mm-hmm. So, do you want to give a quick little insight into who you are, what you do, and what we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, sure. So I am a researcher in medieval history. I currently work at Stockholm University, which is also where I defended my PhD. You can very easily ask yourself, well, what am I doing on a Nordic mythology podcast?
Mm-hmm.
You're looking at shapeshifting in early medieval England and Ireland. The original plan with that was that I was also going to be comparing the Scandinavian material in the same project, but that wound up taking two slightly different tracks. So then my dissertation, my thesis was just the early medieval material, and then my Old Norse shape-shifting research found a home in an article a little bit later on. The most recent project that I finished just a couple of years ago was the Alstrom and Tesserus Fellowship, where I looked at magic and witchcraft as legal concepts in medieval Nordic law. And it's primarily within that context where I have been exploring witchcraft in a medieval Scandinavian Scandinavian context.
Perfect. I'm happy if we take a tangent off into English and Irish witches as well. Don't worry about sticking purely to the Scandinavia, because I know the listeners by now they would be more really we're all just history nerds. So as much as we're all here for a love of all things Viking Age and Nordic mythology and that whole shebang, we really just love cool historical stuff. So don't worry, don't. And I think people know me by now that we always go off on little segments here and there.
And that's really the best, isn't it? That you just kind of, you find a plot bunny and then you just sort of chase it off into the distance somewhere.
That's it. I try to never limit conversation because you never know. We've had some bizarre moments on this show from just going down rabbit holes. So yeah, and that kind of reminds me that you are the guinea pig for a new segment that we've decided to introduce to. So at the end of the show, I think people who've listened to this for a while know that I spend way too much time in Facebook groups, and they're not the best places when it comes to Viking era and themed things. You get all sorts of infighting and just because anybody can make a meme. There's so many memes with misinformation on it, but people take them as facts. So we've now decided to take my love of creeping in Facebook groups and use it for some good. So what we're going to do is the end of each show, hopefully it's going to be a weekly thing, where I take a meme that I found that either holds some truth or is a complete fabrication, or it's just hilarious. And I'm going to bring it to the show, and then at the end, I'm going to discuss it and let people know whether it's real, not real, or which bits are, which bits aren't, or we're all just going to laugh at something silly. So today's meme, I'll read the meme out at the start, and if you want to hear the answer, you can join us at the end, or it just basically keeps people listening to the end as well, I guess. Let's be honest. So today's claim in the meme was Vikings sold narwhal tusks as unicorn horns for centuries during medieval times, cementing European belief in unicorns and leading to the characteristics portrayed. People need punctuation. Cementing European belief in unicorns and leading to the characteristic portrayal of unicorns having long spiraling horns. So that's the meme. There is a lovely unicorn on there. So I did a bunch of research. This turned into, again, as I said before, a rabbit hole. I delved into a huge rabbit hole of unicorns, Vikings, and it was a lot of fun. So I've got tons of notes that we're going to go through at the end. So yeah, keep listening to get that at the end. Like I say, hopefully it's going to be a weekly thing. But Gwendolyne, should we get into witches?
Yes, let's.
Okay. Is there a point that you think is best to start? Because my opening question, I guess, would be, what's a witch in terms of Scandinavia? Because obviously we know, or I know, or most people have that kind of typical witch silhouette: a broom, the pointy hat, the crooked nose, the black cat. Like that would be, I would say, most people's, just if you just like draw a witch.
I mean, that's actually a really good place to start, because as you can probably imagine, I get very popular around this time of year, and almost everything that I have done in sort of connection with Halloween, October, November, that sort of thing, has witchcraft in the title. And within about the first 2 minutes of starting, one of the first things that comes out of my mouth is that, well, actually, we don't really have witches in the sense that we think of them, because the witch, as we have the stereotype, is very much a product of the early modern period, and a particular kind of set of stereotypes that are on their way to forming, on their way to coalescing towards the later medieval period. But this whole kind of idea of a witch, even of a witch that rides on a broomstick, the first kind of visual representation that we have of that isn't until a manuscript from the 15th century. Right. And so when you see a lot of studies from the early modern period, there's a distinction made between witchcraft, the stereotype of the the pact with the devil. People, often women, but not exclusively, who kind of, ride off and gather and do these all sorts of like inverted rituals and eat babies and all of those, delightful things, that we are kind of very familiar with from the trials. Not There's a distinction made between that and then sorcery, which is kind of more magic as outside of that paradigm.
Mm-hmm. So here, it's interesting you said that, because I used to think up until an embarrassing age that witches were just females and wizards were just the male equivalent. That was just, I don't know why, that was just something that just got stuck in my mind, and that's how but also to an embarrassing age, I also thought that tigers were just female and lions were just male. So I can't be trusted on these things, clearly.
I mean, it is funny because we get really stuck into the, particular categorizations. We like to be able to say that, that this particular concept goes with a specific definition, and with magic especially, and even during the Middle Ages, one of the fun things is that, you really kind of can't do that. Because, magic is very much present during the Middle Ages. I think frequently not in the way that we think it is. But even during the Middle Ages, it's not a stable concept at all.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
It changes a lot over time. Frequently sort of like magic-y words like divination of various kinds can be under the magic umbrella. Causing impotence can be under the magic umbrella. And then as time goes on, you have the influx of learned magical texts as well, which introduces a kind of whole other aspect to the concept as well. So trying to answer the question of what is magic, or saying that, the concept of magic has a stable definition, is very difficult to do for the Middle Ages, if not impossible.
Okay. So do we know where the word witch originally comes from?
So witch does derive from Old English word witche, and it is it's interesting because the way that it appears frequently in the Old English text that we have, it's difficult to discern gender. So we can't really tell if specifically in connection with this word, if there's a gendered aspect to it. But it's also not the only label that is used in connection with practices that that we would call magical today, or that for whatever reason the church kind of wants people to desist with. And when we see it being used later on in an early modern context, once it has become witch, then we see it being used much more in a much more directly in a pejorative, sort of accusatory way.
Okay.
That people are not self-identifying as witches in this early period. Like, witch is something that somebody calls you.
Okay, so it's a negative.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So at what point does it become synonymous with only women, or like because like I say, I think for most people, if you said a witch, they would automatically it would be a female.
It's a good question, because I mean it is very much it does tend to be women who are accused of witchcraft. Again, not exclusively. You do have male witches who are accused. Probably one of the biggest drivers in terms of like the popularity of the text is probably the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches.
Sounds very witchy.
At least
it's got a very witchy name.
Well, it was put together by someone who was very committed to fighting witches and to finding witches. But one of the people who was instrumental in putting the Hammer of Witches together was so vitriolic against women and you know, talking about the kind of like women's sexuality in his sermons, that like even the bishop told him to give it a rest for a while. And the misogyny in the Hammer of Witches is really something quite extreme.
Okay. So I've often wondered whether it would, like, calling someone a witch was just an easy way to get rid of probably particularly a woman that you just didn't like or just annoyed you, because I feel like it's an easy claim to make, but incredibly difficult to disprove if once accused of it. Like you could just say, "Oh, I saw so and so doing witchcraft," but then it's so difficult to prove you weren't doing witchcraft.
And it's also, I mean, it comes down a lot as well to precisely what we mean with witchcraft, especially kind of before this period when we're looking at a kind of more coherent witch kind of paradigm. We're very dependent on the particular terms that are used in legal texts and the extent to which these are defined. And sometimes you have, for example, the Icelandic law is really quite wonderful because it sets out the sort of specific terms that it's trying to regulate or say, you know, don't do these kinds of magic. And it is this kind of magic if you do this. So that's obviously very helpful in getting a kind of more concrete sense of if you're accusing someone of sorcery of some kind, what is it you're actually accusing them of? In other legal collections, like some of these Swedish provincial laws, it's just kind of if someone harms someone else with trolldom, and if they are caught doing it, but what is it? Clearly they know, but it's, you know, so culturally understood that it doesn't have to be explained, which isn't very helpful for us when we're trying to read it, you know, several centuries later.
No, I don't suppose it is. Okay, so it seems like is there some magic's acceptable and some isn't?
I mean, that's what's really interesting because again, and you can tell I'm tons of fun at parties. It depends on what you mean by magic.
Okay.
Because I mean, in the Middle Ages, as I mentioned, there is talk of magic. There are concepts of magic that are being written about. But one kind of very important thing is that from this medieval Christian perspective, magic is that which does not, at its basis, does not kind of center the Christian God or sort of the altars associated with the Christian God. And so you can even see the people who are being called magicians of varying kinds and the saints are doing very similar things, if not the same thing. But the key difference is that the saint is drawing their power from God, and the magician is not. And
so would a magician be seen as negative? Because I would always see a magician as being quite a positive magic wielder, maybe on behalf of a king or in that type of situation. I wouldn't put a magician in like a negative light, whereas a witch you kind of automatically have like a negative view of.
Yeah, and I think that's partially because, like, as you sort of move through the Middle Ages, the magician kind of becomes more associated with the kind of power that they can wield, rather than necessarily with rather than kind of as much with this inherent sense of sort of Christian identity creation and maintenance that it has towards the earlier Middle Ages. And I mean, as well, it has to do with when witch is employed in historical sources, it's not employed neutrally, right? It's an accusation of someone who has either harmed someone or who is has engaged in this demonic pact. Whereas depending on what the magician is doing, they might not necessarily even see themselves as counter to the way they think the world should work, or any kind of runs counter to any acceptable behavior. They're just operating within what they see as within the boundaries of what is allowed and proper.
Mm-hmm. I guess it's like anything, and it holds true today. You know, if you're in favor of the right elites, you can get away with a lot more than if you're not. So I assume if you're doing magic on behalf of an elite, whether it's king, queen, whoever, it's or the church, it's seen as favorable and okay. But if you're doing it at home on your own to get back at your pesky neighbor, it's quite negative and frowned upon.
I mean, that's kind of the point, right? Because if we're looking at magic, the specific way that it's used from a medieval perspective, kind of church magic or Christian magic, sort of, it's not a thing, because that's the very idea of magic is something that that separates kind of what we are doing and what is allowed from what those people over there are doing, and which is not the correct ritual. And so the kind of more like magic as understanding of encompassing a set of sort of specific behaviors, trying to use it in a more neutral way is, at least as it's used in research, is something that we have mostly from kind of more anthropological studies.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is something that is that can be a little bit complex when you're working with medieval sources, trying to balance this, you know, how we understand magic today and how we identify magic versus how magic is talked about in the source material.
Mm-hmm. So how, would magic be seen as, I don't know, how do we know how magic would have just been thought of or seen by the everyday person? Because obviously today we have an idea that magic, for the most part, isn't real. It's done by magicians. It's sleight of hand. It's in like that kind of performance magic. But even with most things, I would say most people, if when things happen that are maybe unexplainable, they turn to try and find an act, you know, an explanation for it, a tangible reason to why things happen, whether it's just scientific or whatever. So I guess we would be quite skeptical of magic being a real thing today. Whereas, was it just something that was just accepted as a part of life, a part of just everyday occurrence?
I mean, probably. I think that something that we possibly take for granted today is the assumption that we can explain everything or most things. Mm-hmm. I think kind of what the one comment in the chat, exactly how people understand magic today. There's a lot of variety there, as well, and whether it has a pejorative aspect to it or not can depend a lot on the context. But I think that it's picking up on where I was when I had frozen, easy to forget that before, we had these sort of scientific explanations possible, people simply had to live with the idea that you couldn't explain everything, that there were lots of things you couldn't explain. Mm-hmm. And that, from a more from magic as we understand it today, sort of the being able to affect your world in that way, was in certain contexts a perfectly rational response to how people interacted with their world.
Okay, so you said that they didn't particularly have witches in Scandinavia. What would be the closest thing to a witch?
They didn't have witches in the sense of people who, made pacts with the devil and went off to Sabbaths.
Okay.
I mean, they certainly had people who would who could be accused of harming others through magical means.
Okay.
And in Sweden, for example, trollkonna, a sort of woman who can use magic, is one word that was used, and that continued to be used through the early modern period. It wasn't until the witch trials of the 17th century, if I remember correctly, that hexe was loaned in from German.
Is the harming of people kind of what would make, I guess, a witch a witch? Can you draw that from both sort of England, Ireland, and over to Scandinavia as well? So I guess I'm trying to push for what would be a definition of we can like, how can we like, is there like a to define a witch across the board?
I mean, until we have this kind of paradigm that coalesces towards the later Middle Ages, sort of not really. It's, I mean, even among the medieval Nordic laws, it can differ the degree to which various kinds of magic are appear in a legal context, and exactly in what context they appear. In many of the Swedish laws, for example, it is like this aspect of causing harm is central. Mm-hmm. If you hurt someone, or if you manage to kill someone, then that's kind of that is the problem. In the Norwegian laws, we have more stipulations that are included in the Christian laws section, and so there we have a greater focus on ritual aspects. That people who are performing rituals that are sort of seen as improper, mm-hmm. there is an aspect of, causing harm as well, but this regulation of belief and ritual is much more prominent in the Norwegian material, and in the Icelandic, in Grágás as well.
Do we have examples of how they harmed people? I assume it's harming people through the use of magic.
From specifically the legal material, often not really. It's just that if someone is caught having harmed another person through magic, from the later Middle Ages, we do have some cases in Sweden where someone, for example, has tried to use love magic, and in the 14th century in Norway, there's quite a famous case of Ragnhild Tregagás, who is often described as being kind of one of the earliest witch trials in the Nordic countries. Interestingly enough, kind of magic is not mentioned in the text that we have from the trial. What she's formally accused of is heresy.
Okay.
But in the kind of confession of what she did, the central act is that she attempted to kind of get revenge on her ex-lover who had married someone else, by putting things in their marriage bed, so that, to sow strife in the new happy marriage, and to cause him to be impotent.
He was just sneaking in late at night and leaving a horse's head in the bed.
Except it was loaves of bread, but
is that what it was? Loaves of bread?
Inclusively, yeah. Some other things as well, but
And the bread
kind of interesting how
the bread was to cause impotence?
No, the bread was part of the material that was supposed to sow discord.
I would love if somebody left loaves of bread in my bed.
And she had
like, oh, what a nice surprise this is. Loaves of bread in the bed. Nice.
Oh yay. I can make a sandwich.
Exactly. Did they explain why the bread would cause an issue?
Not within these texts themselves. Maybe it was moldy bread. But she was meant to have said an incantation over kind of all of the things that she left in their bed. As well. And I think part of the reason it was classed as heresy was also because she said that she had kind of gotten this power from the devil to some degree. But what's interesting here is that, there is a putative connection to the sort of center of the Catholic world, where these sort of changes in the formulation of magic and how kind of the church saw magic were taking place. And there's always the kind of question mark of how much of this do we have to thank to a fairly enthusiastic bishop who found themselves in Bergen.
Yeah, I'm so confused by the bread. I'm just, because so it's this kind of leans into my idea of this whole thing that I feel like it's just people trying to use witchcraft as a way to blame somebody for something. Because I understand maybe the idea of her leaving things in the bed to cause strife. It's when people are hurt, particularly in love, they do things out of character, maybe. So maybe for whatever reason at the time, leaving the bread was seen as a matter of disrespect or whatever. It would cause strife in the relationship. But then like adding the incantation to it, it's like, it feels like it's a level of being like, oh, this bread was hexed. That's why it's such a a negative thing. It just feels sometimes it just feels like it's a way to kind of just add an extra layer to things that people do that you can't easily disprove, but it just kind of throws a bit of shit at people. I guess I don't know. The bread one's kind of got me a little bit shook. I don't know how to take that. I'm so confused by why bread would be offensive. But okay, so let's say we have a witch. She performs magic and is accused and caught. Do we know what the punishment would be in Scandinavia? How do they deal with this bread wielding maniac?
Again, that depends a lot on where and when.
Okay.
It can also depend on some of the laws make a distinction between men and women. What particular punishments they will get.
Let me guess, the men's is a little bit lighter.
No, usually it's in cases where they differentiate on the kind of capital punishment you get. They're given different different methods of being executed.
Okay, but is death usually the outcome for witchcraft?
It can be. You have to go through a sort of series of steps a lot of the time. I mean, you need to you need to be convicted, and that's not always an easy thing to do, because if you can gather enough witnesses to speak in your favor, you can effectively speak yourself free.
Okay.
And occasionally, if you haven't been caught red-handed, or if the person didn't die, then in theory, it could also be possible to just be charged with a fine.
Okay.
Of course, if you were poor and you couldn't pay the fine, there were frequently consequences for that, which were not so nice.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the time, in order to be executed, you had at the very least to be caught in the act, or the person had to have died.
Mm-hmm. What would be? Do we have any examples of somebody being caught in the act? Like, what does, like a cauldron, just mixing up a potion? Like, how do you catch someone in the act of witchcraft, I guess?
It's really not an easy question to answer, because in cases where we have a description of, like, this is what we understand with various magic terms, or if it has to do more with teaching someone magic or with knowing certain things, that's one thing. But sometimes it just says, if a person is caught using magic, and we don't really get much more explanation than that.
Okay.
Or we get an explanation that itself is fairly poetic, and so it's kind of, okay, what does this mean?
Do we get any of those I mean, you may tell me these aren't even real, but like those trials of witch has been dunked in water, and if they drown, they're not a witch, but if they survive, they're a witch, and then they get burned. Do we get any cases of that where like people are put on that sort of trial?
Not from the Middle Ages.
Okay.
Part of the reason for that, at least in Scandinavia, is because we simply don't have court records that go back that far, or they go back far enough. to really give us that kind of evidence. I think that the water test was something that was developed later on anyway. It's not something I'm familiar with, at least from medieval contexts. But part of the reason why the case of Ragnhild in the 14th century is so spectacular is because we simply have so few trials for, where we can say that someone has done something that, we would recognize as magic. From a Scandinavian context.
What about in England and in Ireland? And in Ireland, were we just dunking everyone in water as well? What were we doing over here?
I mean, interestingly enough, there is, so much of the kind of medieval material can be a little bit of a question of interpretation. There's one case from the 10th or 11th century in England, where a woman is found. It's within the context of a larger case, but she's found with some nails or kind of sticks of iron, and the consequence of the whole thing is that she's drowned. Here, magic is kind of never explicitly mentioned. She's not necessarily accused of having used any magical means, but the presence of these nails has got people to think that some kind of harmful magic was at play here, potentially.
Okay.
It's a question of interpretation. But the connection with sort of the drowning is interesting. As far as I know, the water test was not used in the Middle Ages. But
it wasn't necessarily just specific the water test. I was just did we have any other weird kind of ways to test whether somebody was a witch? Because like we were saying before, it is one of those things where I guess you could talk yourself out of because it's hard to prove. So I didn't know whether we had some bizarre test, because there is nothing like the creativity of medieval torture. That's like, people's creativity juices were flowing during that time period.
I think in some cases, ordeals were used to test if someone was telling the truth. To test whether or not their claim of not having used magic was true or not. A lot of times, if you could find enough witnesses to attest that you were kind of an upstanding member of society, then that was sort of your biggest aid, and that's why so much of this comes back to reputation, and other places where we see witchcraft or witches mentioned is that it is an insult to call someone a witch or to call someone a trollkona. And that if you've called someone a witch and they can sort of prove that you lied,
okay,
then you can then be done for libel effectively.
Yeah, it's fair enough. So you should be. You can't just go around calling everybody a witch now.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's a lot really goes back to not only reputation, but also just kind of keeping the peace within a community, and resolving conflict. in various ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Because otherwise, you could just be going around like, "You're a witch." I don't like you. You're a witch. Uh, you looked at me funny. Like you're a witch. Do you think? But also, do you think this idea that oh well, if you had enough popularity, you could get off with not necessarily being a witch, but with being accused of a witch. Do you think that's why this idea of a modern, the modern kind of image of a witch is a recluse? It's always somebody who's, solemn. They're on their own, kind of plotting in a cave somewhere, maybe, or in a house, an old wooden shack somewhere. Do you think that comes from this idea that if you were popular, then you could get away with the trial or get out of it, whereas the ones who were lonely and on their own and unpopular just couldn't, and they tend to maybe be the ones who wound up being found guilty of being witches?
I mean, I think that if you were popular enough, you probably wouldn't be getting accused in the first place. And that even if you had certain claims to, being a village wise woman, that if you were popular enough, people wouldn't see you as a witch because they wouldn't see you as causing harm.
Okay.
Or they wouldn't see you as a witch because, there was sort of nothing to accuse you of, so to speak. And because that goes back to, once we do see the word witch being used, it's an accusatory term. It's not a self-identification. It's not really something that people are applying to people that they think well of.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it's also worth asking, how much of our image of the witch we can simply thank these accusers for, because there's a lot of literature about sort of what a witch is and how you identify a witch, from the early modern period onwards, and certainly people who were accused were often vulnerable in some way, and yes, someone who was going to be a recluse, who wasn't really interacting in society, would be vulnerable in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a lot in our kind of the stereotypes that we hold, that are more related to sort of this image that was built up of witches over time, more than kind of boots on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Members of the community who were being accused and who saw themselves as doing certain acts of potentially magic, potentially just kind of helpful things in the community.
What about pre-Christianity? Do we see like a witches then, or is it mainly kind of after that time?
I mean, this is where we kind of come back around a little bit to, is magic a term that, at least just thinking a little bit critically about how we use magic and witch, because in a context where that sort of polemic aspect isn't present, then sort of what would a witch be in that context?
Mm-hmm.
Because people are obviously still going to cause harm, and there is still going to be a concept of this being able to happen in a way that's, maybe not necessarily visible or tangible. And surely, a pre-Christian society would have to have some way to deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
But absent that idea of magic being a specific set of non-licit behaviors or practices, then how that would fit into the worldview is a really interesting question.
Yeah, I guess the example that comes to mind would be something like the Volva from
Mm.
like Nordic mythology. Like, would they class as a witch? Because it's certainly like a prophecy magic type figure. But then obviously they seem to be hailed and celebrated rather than persecuted. And I just wondered if we saw any examples of that or how they would have been seen.
Within a pre-Christian context or after?
Both, I guess. If we know how they were looked at in a because obviously we're right on that cusp of when we're talking about the Vikings, we're on that cusp of everything becoming Christian anyway. It's like it's during the Viking Age that Christianity takes hold of pretty much all of Europe. So yeah, I guess even just looking back from maybe the Icelandic saga literature, or is there any examples where they would speak maybe negatively in a Christian context, speak negatively of the Volvers and what that kind of figure?
I mean, there's just kind of so many different angles that you can come at that from. So I think that in a pre-Christian context, we would probably not be looking at the vulva as a kind of witch, because the paradigm that we are dealing with is that a lot of the sort of aspects of vulva-ness kind of overlap with how we see witches. But within that context, I think they're not really working, they're not causing harm in the same way that we would expect a witch to. And something that's, very interesting in a lot of the saga material is that when we do have magic mentioned in things like the Icelandic sagas, it's not usually flagged as being counter to a Christian worldview. Like this sort of like Christian element isn't kind of what's making magic problematic.
Mm-hmm.
One of the more spectacular examples, because it does result in a woman being executed, is an Eyrbyggja saga, the disagreement between Geirridr and Katla. And what's interesting here is that Geirridr and Katla, they're both described as, in different ways, being able to perform magic. Mm-hmm. And Geirridr is even teaching magic to a young man. And part of what kind of causes the whole conflict is that there's sort of Katla is trying to, compete with Geirridr for the sexual attentions of this young man.
Okay.
And ultimately as well, people are coming to find Katla's son because he has committed a crime, and she hides him through the use of magic. And that's, even though they're both described as being able to perform magic, it's only Katla that we see doing it. And she's performing magic in order to harm the young man, whose sexual attentions she couldn't win, and to hide her son, who has putatively performed a crime.
Okay.
Right. And that's the problem. Well, and the fact that she doesn't have as good a reputation as Geirridr does.
So it seems as though popularity is a big part, but also this idea of of causing harm, using magic to harm somebody else is then what would get you labeled a witch, I guess.
I mean, at least that would sort of make you a criminal for it.
Okay. So are there good witches, or would they be just would that be another word used for people who use magic for positive reasons? I guess as maybe a healer, because some people would associate witches with, I guess, with healing.
Yeah, sure. And I think that um in a lot of contexts it depends on um who is calling you what and why.
Okay.
Um it depends the context where something is used, because I can very well imagine that, even if trollkona was an insult, that you could take someone to court for having called you that in particular context it was just, a woman who could work magic.
Mm-hmm.
Um and it's difficult when we just don't have these words that are being used in multiple contexts at the same time,
Okay.
right? Because if we only have one particular kind of source material, there's sort of no corrective for that. Mm-hmm. And then as well, if we accept that witch is an accusatory term, then you can certainly have people who are healing within a society, who are performing, healing functions, but they wouldn't be seen as witches as long as they didn't not succeed so badly that they really pissed someone off.
Oh, fair enough. Okay, seeing as it's spooky season, is there any scary or gruesome story you can think of to end on that kind of springs to mind? Maybe like a little tale or a happening or event where, just to put you on the spot. I don't know if you can't think of one, it's fine also.
Oh gosh.
Or is it just loaves of bread, haunted loaves of bread, just causing trouble?
I love that, off the top of my head, it's the loaves of bread are the only part of what she left in the bread that I can remember.
See, maybe the loaves of bread just had like razor blades in, and then that was the real issue. Or maybe she poisoned them. I don't know.
Oh gosh. I love as well that that's the thing that's sort of stuck in your mind as well.
Oh yeah. The obscure things always do. Yeah. Okay, is there anything that we've missed that we need to know about witches, you think, before I get onto my unicorn rant?
I think I'm going to let you go on to your unicorn rant. I've been looking forward to that for the last hour.
Onto my unicorn rant.
Yeah, go on.
Well, it might go terrible. So it's the first time I've tried this segment, so we'll see how it goes. Yeah, so feel free to interject if there's anything you want to talk about whilst I go through the facts of this weird kind of claim. So just to recap, the meme that I found claimed, I'm going to try and read it with the terrible punctuation that's there. Probably just need to take a really deep breath beforehand. So the claim is, Vikings sold narwhal horns as unicorn horns for centuries during medieval times, cementing European beliefs in unicorns and leading to the characteristic portrayal of unicorns having long, spiraling horns. Okay, that's the claim. So we can take a look at it if it's real. Like I say, I've done a bunch of reading. So the answer, in really short, is that as much as it seems like a real wild claim, there is some elements of truth to it, but just not all of it. And it seems that the confusion, or the true part, is that the confusion between the narwhal horn and unicorn horns may have actually started with Vikings. And there's some theories suggest that as the Scandinavians reached Greenland, they began to find narwhal horns washed up on the shore, or they were even hunting them. And we do know that narwhal horns were prized possessions of the rulers of Scotland and Denmark. And it's thought that the horns were sold to wealthy Europeans as unicorn horns. So they, for anybody that hasn't seen a narwhal horn, you can see how they become confused with unicorn horns. They're I mean, a narwhal on its own is a mythical creature. If I'd never seen one before and somebody just showed me a narwhal, I'd be like, oh, well, you're not a real thing. It's an odd looking thing, isn't it? It could quite easily be fiction. But it seems that that's where the truth ends when it comes to this claim. So the trade between Vikings and Europeans isn't the reason that Europeans believe in unicorns. So the earliest possible imagery of a unicorn seems to date back to around 3000 BC in Mesopotamia and Egypt, and the first written mention is in Greece, and I'm going to fuck this pronunciation up, but Cetas gives the first description in 400 BCE in his book Indica, and he says, or he describes them as fleet of foot, having a horn of a cubit and a half in length, coloured white, red, and black. And in the 1st century CE, Pliny the Elder writes of a fierce animal he calls monoceros, or a single horn, which has the head of a stag, the feet of an elephant, the tail of a boar, while the rest of the body looks like that of a horse. It makes a deep lowing noise, and a single black horn which projects from the middle of the forehead about 2 cubits in length. Now, could possibly be just talking about a rhino. But so as we know that unicorns existed prior to the Viking Age. We know that unicorns existed prior to the Vikings trading the narwhal horns with the Europeans. But to fully understand why it held such a value, you have to look back further and kind of look at Christianity, as always. So it's believed there's a mistranslation of the word ox in the Bible's old Hebrew text, which led to the unicorn being mentioned in the Bible itself. So in the 2nd century CE, a Greek Christian text described the unicorn as a strong, fierce animal whose horn could purify poisoned waters. It also states that a unicorn can be subdued into cooperation by a virgin maiden, and this caused them to become loving and docile. These characteristics caused the unicorn to become linked to Christ himself, and the medieval paintings use the unicorn as a symbol of Christ. So then we have to look at unicorns and poison, because this is the reason why they become so valuable. So being a king or queen or any high rank in a league clearly has its dangers. And one of the things they feared most was poison. And that's because obviously the threat can come from you can be delivered anonymously. It's invisible. Most of the time, it's fatal when poisoned. So because of this, the elite would look for mythical and magical items that could neutralize or expose the use of poison. And yes, the most sought-after item was, of course, the unicorn horn. So typically, the unicorn horn would then be a narwhal horn or a rhinoceros horn. By the time of the Renaissance, the unicorn horn became a cure for poison, and their value was about 10 times their weight. So the unicorn horn, whether it was the narwhal horn or the rhinoceros horn, would be about 10 times its weight in gold. So you can see why these are such valuable things. They weigh more than they would in gold. So clearly, if you can get hold of one, it's going to do you some good if you can trade it. In 1533, Pope Clement VII presented the King Francis I of France with a magnificent horn molded in solid gold. Ivan the Terrible had a staff made from one. Philip II of Spain apparently had 12. He really was flexing with, unicorn horns. The royal Habsburg family placed one of their tusks in a scepter covered in gemstones. And in the late 1600s, Christian V of Denmark sat on a throne of unicorn horns. And even Queen Elizabeth I, who was known for being quite skeptical of things, bought a long spiral unicorn horn for £10,000 and was rumored to drink from a unicorn cup that was seen to be so valuable that she said that it had to be kept with the crown jewels. And it was said that if poison came in contact with the cup, it would explode. So to summarize all that up, that long-winded explanation up, it's likely that the Vikings did trade narwhal horn with the Europeans, and they did probably sell them as unicorn horn because of their value. But the reason that it's got enormous wealth is its healing properties, is because it could find poison effectively, that it could heal poison, whether it exposed it when it was put in it or it actually healed it itself. But there is one account whilst I was reading and kind of researching this that I couldn't leave out. And that was in the 6th century, there's an explanation of why the unicorn is so elusive. And we're told that the unicorn's power resides in its horn. And when placed in danger, a unicorn would happily throw itself off a cliff to escape. And it would land expertly on the point of its horn, unharmed. And then I don't know how it kind of got itself out. If you can just imagine a unicorn just stuck in the ground by its horn, it must have then righted itself somehow and just trotted off. But that's one explanation for why we don't find them. So if Sophie, our resident artist, would like to draw that, I would love to see an image of a unicorn just kind of coming off a cliff and just stuck point down. So there you go. That's my research of that meme. What's true, what's not true. That's the best that I could find. Obviously, if I've gone wrong in there anyway, please somebody let me know. But I found it fascinating. So hopefully everyone else enjoyed it. Gwendolyne, hopefully you liked a little bit of unicorn knowledge, I guess.
I'm very, very pleased to have that bit of unicorn knowledge, and I can even draw it in with the theme of the day as well, because in medieval contexts, poison is very often associated with magic, to the extent that sometimes when we see a word like beneficium, which usually means poison, we can be a little bit unsure if it's being used as a shorthand for kind of magic more broadly.
Oh wow!
Mm-hmm.
Well, there we go. Gwendolyne, we should jump over and do the Q&A. I've seen some questions already popping up in the chat that we can get to. Do you want to let people know where they can? I don't know if you have a public persona you'd like to share, whether it's an Instagram or Twitter, or people, any books out.
Right now I have the cat that is trying to hunt my hand. Sorry. My doctoral thesis, The Broken Order, Shapeshifting, a Social Metaphor in Early Medieval England and Ireland, which is on the sort of image rota that you had used to advertise. That's freely available online. It's open access. The book based on my project on witchcraft as a legal concept is currently in production, so that is not available yet. But as soon as it is, then it will hopefully be published open access as well. So anyone who wants to read it can. I do have an academia.edu page, which is woefully behind where it should be. Mm-hmm. But that is what I have available as far as a public presence goes at the moment, unfortunately.
Wow,
I'll have to work on that.
We didn't even talk about shape-shifting, so we're definitely going to get into that in the Q&A. I'm going to have some questions. Usually, sometimes the Q&A just turns into me asking more questions as well. So if you do want to listen to the Q&A and the shape-shifting answers we're going to get, it's on our Patreon /Nordic Mythology podcast, £3 a month, 10p a day. It does help the show keep going. We really do appreciate it. And if you want to follow me, it's just Daniel_Farrand1. Still haven't managed to claim it without the one on the end, but hey ho, we carry on. And just Nordic Mythology podcast. And if you want to support the business, it's at Horns of Odin. And yeah, that's it. Let's do some questions.